Well, hello everyone and welcome to this revision video for OCR GCSE History, Elizabethans 1580 to 1603. In this revision video, we're going to look at the idea of the wider world and the nature and significance of England's connection with the wider world. Okay, in terms of key content for this part of the course, we're going to learn about the wider world, nature and significance of England's connections with the wider world. We're going to think about imperial ambition, so the motives and achievements of Elizabethan adventurers. We'll look at Roanoke, England's attempts at an American colony. And we're going to look at trade with the East, including first contacts with India. Yes, so just a reminder about how you're going to be assessed for the Elizabethans exam. So for question 6, you'll be given an historical interpretation and you'll have to identify and explain one way in which the historian puts across a particular point of view. For 6B, you're asked to do some further research on one aspect of interpretation A. So you're going to decide what you're going to choose to investigate. So you're going to identify the area for research, write your own inquiry question linked to a second order concept and explain how that would help a historian to further understand. And then question 7 is about two different historical interpretations. You have to explain how far they differ and what might explain the difference between them. And then question 8 and 9, you've got a choice for this question. It's a 20-mark question, 4 key arguments. You're looking for that degree of balance, and then finishing up with a conclusion, your clinching argument. Okay, so within this presentation, we're going to look at 6 key individuals during this time to really hone in on the idea of Elizabethan adventurers. We're going to find out about Dr. John Dee. We're going to learn about Francis Drake, Humphrey Gilbert, Walter Raleigh, Ralph Fitch and James Lancaster. So there are 6 key individuals that you really need to know a lot about. So we'll zone in on them in a little bit more detail. So you can kind of look at them in pairs. So Dr. John Dee and Francis Drake are significant for the idea of the British Empire and improving knowledge of seafaring through Dee's books on navigations and Drake's experiences of circumnavigating the globe between 1577 and 1580. Remember, it's Dr. John Dee who came up with the idea of the British Empire in his very famous speech to Elizabeth I. We've then got Humphrey Gilbert and Walter Raleigh, who began the first attempt to set up colonies in the Americas. Gilbert was at Newfoundland and Raleigh had gone on a reconnaissance voyage to discover Roanoke. Raleigh then explored Guyana in South America. Although attempts failed, the knowledge gained allowed North American colonies to be set up in the 17th century, with Jamestown eventually becoming the first permanent colony. And then Ralph Fitch and James Lancaster are important to developing trade with the East. Ralph Fitch spent 8 years travelling around Mughal, India, gathering important knowledge about trading routes in the East. James Lancaster led the first expedition of the East India Company, which paved the way for trade and eventual colonisation of India. Okay, so let's find out more about why Elizabethans sought to explore new worlds. Well, John Dee has a lot to answer for this. So John Dee was the person that came up with the idea of the British Empire, the concept of the British Empire. So John Dee was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I on science and astrology. And in 1577, he presented a new plan to Elizabeth about shifting the balance of power from Spain to England. During the golden age of Spain, it had become an international power by creating a huge empire in Central and South America. And Dee's proposal was that English adventurers should search new routes to the rich markets of China and the East Indies. Dee advised the Queen to establish colonies in North America, and his vision was called the British Empire. And he produced maps and books to help with navigation. Okay, now Francis Drake was also really important to really thinking about the idea of Elizabethan adventurers. Francis Drake became a national hero when he sailed around the world. He was the first Englishman to do this, and on his way he claimed territory and captured Spanish treasure. Now in November 1577, Francis Drake left Plymouth with 5 ships and 170 men, and he attacked Spanish and Portuguese ships off the coast of West Africa. He entered the Straits of Magellan, claimed several islands for the Queen. No English sailor had been there before. He raided native settlements along the coast of Chile and Peru in 1578 to 79, and in June 1579 he landed in California and claimed it for the Queen, calling it New Albion. In the summer of 1579 he headed towards Cape of Good Hope. In the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, he traded linen cloth for cloves, ginger and pimento. And then in September 1580 he returned to England with vast amounts of pillages, treasures for investors, the Queen and himself. He was knighted by the Queen on board his flagship, the Golden Hind. Now this historical interpretation of Francis Drake from Look and Learn magazine very much shows you the idea of Francis Drake arriving in Plymouth in September 1580 and suggests that Francis Drake was this sort of very heroic figure, and certainly in Victorian times in the early 20th century, he was certainly regarded like that in English history. So yeah, this map just shows you the route that Francis Drake took on his circumnavigation of the world in a single expedition, which he did between 1577 and 1580. So you can just sort of visualize that and all the different places that he actually went to. Drake wanted to impress the Queen. Elizabeth sponsored his voyage and he hoped to find new lands to claim for the Queen. Drake was a Puritan and wanted to weaken Spain, which was a Catholic power. He also sought to capture gold, silver and other treasures and establish new trade routes on his route as well. Now, in terms of the impact of Drake's voyage, Drake was knighted aboard his ship, the Golden Hind. He was the first Englishman to successfully sail around the world, and his success challenged Spain's dominance of the New World, and his actions weakened Philip II of Spain. He brought back gold, silver and jewels worth around £140,000, which is about 200 million in today's money. The Queen's share was worth more than her entire income for a whole year. Drake also claimed new lands for England and made valuable trading contacts with the Spice Islands, which is a group of islands near Indonesia. Okay, moving on to the Americas, Humphrey Gilbert, who you can see pictured here, tried to set up a colony in Newfoundland. It failed, but it did have some important impacts and legacy. So Humphrey Gilbert went on an expedition to establish England's first colony in North America. Gilbert wished to establish a northwest passage around America, which would give England a trade route with China. Gilbert hated Catholic Spain and presented Queen Elizabeth I with his ideas on how a colony in North America could provide a base to attack Spanish ships. In 1578, Queen Elizabeth granted him a charter to establish a colony in North America. His first attempt in 1579 was a disaster. Only the ship, captained by his younger half-brother Walter Raleigh, managed to cross the Atlantic. But in 1583, Gilbert planned a scheme to claim lands in North America and sell the land to wealthy Englishmen. His fleet of 5 ships left Plymouth in June 1583. Gilbert arrived at St John's, Newfoundland, which is in modern-day Canada. Many English, Spanish and Portuguese boats were there as the port had been used by European fishermen for decades. Gilbert took possession of Newfoundland by digging some turf and putting up a post which had the arms of England engraved in it. Gilbert claimed the land but failed to establish a colony. The land was cold and barren, food was scarce, and his fleet sailed south with one ship getting wrecked off the rocky coast, killing 80. The fleet got caught in violent storms on the way home, and Gilbert's ship, the Squirrel, sank with Gilbert himself drowning. Okay, so Walter Raleigh made plans for a colony at Roanoke in Virginia. So Walter Raleigh was a flamboyant character and he was a favourite of Elizabeth in her court in the 1580s. Walter Raleigh wished to establish a colony in North America and he hoped to find a northern sea route from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Now Raleigh knew that the gold and silver mines of Central and South America had made Spain and Portugal incredibly wealthy. He hoped to discover gold in North America. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth I granted him a royal charter to explore and colonise North America in return for 1/5 of the gold-silver found there. In April 1584, Raleigh set off on a reconnaissance voyage where they discovered an island called Roanoke. They made contact with local Algonquin people. Now Richard asked his friend Richard Hakluyt to write a pamphlet explaining the benefits of colonisation. It focused on spreading Christianity, trade benefits and providing a base to attack Spanish treasure ships. The Queen did not allow Raleigh to lead the expedition to Roanoke in 1585. Instead, it was led by Raleigh's cousin Richard Grenville and military commander Ralph Lane. Okay, so let's have a look at the Roanoke colony in a little bit more detail. So there's a 1585 expedition to Roanoke in North America. So Walter Raleigh himself was not allowed to leave the royal court, so the expedition of 600 soldiers, sailors and colonists was led by Sir Richard Grenville and Ralph Lane. They took a scientist, Thomas Harriot, and an artist, John White, to record the people, landscapes and wildlife. The expedition of 600 colonists left Plymouth in April 1585. Now, 7 ships carried 600 people, but storms meant only 1 ship survived. Grenville got split up from the rest of the group. When the ship arrived in July 1585, it got stuck in sandbanks as storms approached, and the settlers lost most of their supplies, including the seeds they had brought. Grenville returned to England to get more settlers, while Lane stayed behind as governor with 107 men to build a settlement and fort on Roanoke Island. The relations between the settlers and the native Algonquin people were at first really good. The Algonquin people supplied corn, but as supplies ran low, tensions built and Lane attacked the natives after learning the natives were going to attack the colony. The Algonquin chief, who was called Wingina, was killed, and the Algonquin became more hostile. As supplies continued to run low, the colony was abandoned and the settlers were rescued by Francis Drake in 1586. Now, a second expedition was led by John White in 1587 to establish a colony at Chesapeake Bay. He left the colony in 1588 for more supplies, and when he returned in 1590, there was an established fort, but the people there had disappeared, and historians do not know what happened to them. The cryptic word Croatoan was found carved into the palisade of the fort, which White interpreted to mean the colonists had relocated to Croatoan Island, but no trace was ever found. Okay, so the Roanoke colony had failed, but the English did learn a lot from the colony, with Thomas Harriot and John White publishing an account in their brief and true report of the Newfoundland of Virginia, which helped the colony of Jamestown get founded in 1607. So it created the long-term knowledge that was necessary. In 1595, Walter Raleigh set out to discover gold in the fabled city of Manoa, El Dorado, in the region of Guyana. It also failed, but his knowledge helped also in future colonizations. So looking at the impact of Raleigh's colonisation, one of the impacts that led to a stronger economy. Improved trade links led to merchants and investors becoming very wealthy. Investors made large profits from cargoes of gold and silver captured from Spanish ships by sailors such as Francis Drake and John Hawkins. Elizabethans set up new trading companies such as the Levant Company and the East India Company, and these new trading companies would become very powerful in the 17th century, particularly the East India Company, which we can learn about in more detail in a moment. The impact of Raleigh's colonisation led to a stronger navy. A voyage of exploration improved the skills of English sailors. They gained experience of fighting at sea. They started to make use of new technologies such as triangular sails. John Hawkins overhauled the English Navy when he became Treasurer of the English Navy in 1578, and that led to faster ships equipped with quick-firing cannon, which helped to defeat the Spanish Armada. Harriet and White turned their records into a book called A Brief and True Report of the Newfoundland of Virginia. Raleigh's next expedition had been to the city of Manoa in Guyana, South America. Spain had built up a large empire in the New World and the Americas, and during the Elizabethan period, the English sailors had started to challenge the dominance of Spanish sailors. For example, the Spanish Armada was defeated, and Walter Raleigh had tried to set up the colony at Roanoke. So explorers such as Walter Raleigh set up colonies overseas. Although they were not successful, they created foundations for the British Empire. Just have a little look at Walter Raleigh's relationship with Elizabeth, which is quite interesting to look at. So Raleigh was a favourite of Elizabeth, and he'd spent time in Ireland fighting Catholics who rebelled against Elizabeth. He was given a lot of land in England and Ireland as a reward. During the 1580s, as we've seen, Raleigh tried to set up a colony in North America, which he would have named Virginia. He financed 2 voyages, one to Roanoke in 1585 and then the other one to Chesapeake Bay in 1587, which was led by John White. In the summer of 1592, he married Bess Throckmorton, one of Elizabeth's maid of honours, without her permission. Elizabeth sent both Raleigh and Bess to the Tower of London. Raleigh was released after a few months, but was banned from court and had to wait 5 years before Elizabeth would speak to him. In 1595, Raleigh led an expedition to South America to try and find the legendary city of El Dorado. In 1596, he wrote a book called The Discovery of the Large, Rich and Beautiful Empire of Guyana. His tales of riches encouraged other explorers. He was imprisoned after and again during James I's reign, and he was executed after Spanish pressure in 1618. Okay, so we're just going to have a look at the beginning of trading routes with the East now, and trade with the East, including first contacts with India. So wealthy Elizabethans wanted luxury goods from India and China. So silk, cotton, jewels, perfumes were fashionable for clothing and furnishings. Spices such as cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, ginger and pepper were used for preserving and flavouring food. They were expensive in Europe, but Portugal began to transport these goods by sea around southern Africa. Spain invaded Portugal in 1580, leading to fears the spice trade would be disrupted, and London merchants formed the Turkey Company in 1581, and they were granted a monopoly, which was the sole right to trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. So Ralph Fitch established England's first direct links with the Mughal Empire. So in 1583, a London merchant called Ralph Fitch set off on a journey to India with 4 others. Only Fitch would return. Fitch had been asked to find out about opportunities for trade in India, Southeast Asia and China by the Turkey Company that we just learnt about. They carried letters of introduction from Queen Elizabeth to the Mughal and Chinese emperors, with the greatest civilizations in the world in the 1580s. Fitch and the others left Falmouth in March 1583 and travelled to the Portuguese trading station of Hormuz. Here they were arrested as spies and imprisoned. Fitch was taken across the Indian Ocean to Goa, the main Portuguese colony in India. After release, Fitch carried on his journey to visit Mughal Emperor Akbar in northern India, where they were amazed at the goods such as diamonds, cloth, peppers and other spices for sale. Fitch travelled across India, reaching as far as the Himalayas. He gained important knowledge about the sea trade with China and the Moluccas, the Spice Islands. Fitch arrived back in England in 1591, a journey of 8 years, and for most of his journey he travelled alone, relying on his own skills. Fitch wrote an account of his journey and enabled people to learn more about India. So the impact of Fitch was that his account of his travels showed the opportunities available in England that England had in the East. Fitch learned a huge amount about the wealth and trade of India, China and the Spice Islands. He saw the gems, spices, cloths, dyes and drugs that were available in India. He wrote about the people, customs and goods he had seen. Merchants in England were interested in the trade opportunities described, and also they were worried about losing out to competitors. So Fitch very much paved the way for the East India Company to be established in 1600, and this changed England's trade forever. So James Lancaster was a merchant who travelled east in 1591. His voyage was a disaster, with one ship sinking on the way and the Portuguese preventing him from trading in the East Indies. Only 25 men survived when his fleet reached England in May 1594. 6 years later, however, Lancaster was much more successful. On the 22nd of September 1600, 100 leading merchants met in Founders Hall, London, to create a new company called the East India Company. The merchants were concerned about the Dutch taking over trade in the East Indies. Queen Elizabeth granted the company a monopoly to trade in the East. Lancaster was chosen to command the 4 ships that set out in 1601. It was a huge success. Lancaster established England's first warehouse in the East at Bantam on the island of Java. English ships had begun trading in the East. The East India Company would eventually realise John Dee's dream of a British Empire. In the 17th century, the East India Company opened factories on the coast of India. By the 18th century, it ruled vast parts of India and was the biggest trading company the world has ever seen until it was disbanded in 1858. So just putting it into context in terms of voyages and trade, exploration was made possible in Elizabethan times because of better maps and sea charts, made it easier to navigate around the world. The printing press allowed maps to be printed, and the magnetic compass improved navigation. In terms of ship design, improved sails led to stronger and faster ships that could carry more goods home to England. Triangular sails, which could easily be turned to catch the strong winds, allowed ships to sail in any direction. Improved rudders gave the crew more control in steering ships. Ships were fitted with the latest rapid-firing guns, and English ships targeted Spanish treasure ships. So just a reminder of some of the different trading companies that set up in the 16th century. The Eastland Company was set up in 1579 to trade in timber, tar and rope with Scandinavia. The Muscovy Company was set up in pre-Elizabethan times to trade timbers and furs with Russia, and that was a company that still existed in Elizabethan times. The Levant Company was set up in 1581 to trade goods such as currant and dyes in the Mediterranean. And the East India Company was set up in 1600 to trade in the Far East in spices, cotton, silks and tea. So Hugh Willoughby and Richard Chancellor are other good examples of Elizabethan adventurers. They crossed the Arctic Ocean and travelled to Moscow in one of the first attempts to find a North Passage to Asia during this time. So lots and lots of different people involved in this topic. So I hope you enjoyed that revision video about the wider world and the Elizabethan times, focusing on our key Elizabethan adventurers there and explorers. Thanks very much for listening. Bye bye.